I want you to get together.
But there's one book which was released in 2019 by the Vatican. Now, I don't know what you think or feel about this book. I'd like your opinion on it. But there's a book called The Book of Lamech of Cain and Leviathan.
Yes,
Okay.
I've
Now,
read it.
I've read it too, and it gives some fascinating. I'm taking it all with a pinch of salt, because you just don't know about the sources of this, but it
Yeah.
explains some very interesting things. And one interesting thing I took away from it, never mind, we're talking about Noah's wife and who she was, but we're talking about even Lamech from Cain's lineage didn't know who Cain mated with to create all the people. Even he was confused in his time,
Yeah.
like 6 generations, 7 generations down. I think it was just before the seventh generation the curse was supposed to be lifted, which was the mark of Cain, and he was that last generation. And he wanted to know, well, first of all, why do we all have leprous white sick skin? Which
Yeah.
fits into my Nephilim look like clowns theory, by the way. I'll just quickly slip that in
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
but he's confused. He goes on a quest to discover who did Cain mate with to create us. If Adam and Eve were, even he didn't know the knowledge, the level of knowledge by that generation had been so corrupted and occulted that even him himself, a direct descendant of Cain, was confused about where all these people came from. The knowledge was hidden, suppressed, done within 6 generations from Adam. And he goes around and he doesn't like the answers he gets. He gets answers from people and he murders them after hearing it. The thought that he is the product of a human that wasn't created from Adam, of Cain mixing with these other people, he
Yeah.
didn't like that
Yeah.
idea from the set. If we fit in your theory, he didn't like that answer that you're giving right now. He never says what the answer is in the Book of Lamech.
Yeah.
He never mentions
Does
what he
not.
was told, but as soon as he was told, he got Leviathan, his lizard pet, to eat them. And it's interesting. What do you think
Yeah.
of that?
Yeah. And what happens afterwards is you have the creation of the giants in the book of Lamech as well.
Hmm.
So something really interesting is going on. And in other versions, you actually have Cain marrying Lilith,
Hmm.
which is the daughter of Lilith, one of the queens of heaven, and creates a bloodline, a royal dynasty from there. And so you're down to Cain marrying with fallen angels, or you're marrying with day six people, or
Hmm.
maybe both. Um,
Well, he lived for a long time. Who knows? I mean,
exactly. And
yeah.
who was he afraid of?
Well,
Well, he got this
exactly.
part. And
Yeah.
it's defined in the book of Lamech of Cain that this mark is that pale white skin,
Hmm.
this leprosy look. That's the mark. Um, and that's how people would recognize them, and that it would somehow distinguish him
Hmm.
that he is of the angels
Hmm.
or of the authority of God, I guess, as biblically as you would put on it. So,
Hmm.
and it also talks about, I mean, it's a fascinating read in there, but there is a hidden history that it has been protected throughout the mysteries throughout history that they don't want to get out. So even with what we're able to sort of glean into it, there's probably even more going on there
Hmm.
than what we suspect. And why would and again biblically we're not told what that mark is other than it's the Hebrew word oath, which means some sort of sign, an authority.
Hmm.
And it's similar to, you like get an oath as in a sworn oath or like the blood that's painted on the sills and the jambs of the time of Exodus as
Hmm.
a sign, but it's not that, but maybe it's that ruddy skin color as well that sort of is combining in there where that's white and red, just as Noah is described that way and just
Hmm.
described what giants sort of looked like with that very pale LB Gens type of skin,
Hmm. I think it's
with that ruddy
described.
sort of reddish tinge to
Yeah,
it,
I think
a
he was.
pinkish tinge.
Noah was described exactly as having red and white skin. That's what he
Yeah,
says, doesn't it? And then
yeah,
his father runs off to his father. He's like, "I think I've given birth to a Nephilim," and he
yeah,
has this glowing white skin and this glowing golden
yeah,
hair, and his eyes are glowing, and he's just radiating this divine light. And
yeah,
as the progenitor of the future of mankind, I'm not surprised he had a divineness to him.
yeah,
That doesn't necessarily
yeah,
mean he was Nephilim, but what we do know is the Nephilim had divine traits, such as
yes,
white skin
yeah,
mixed with red. And if he describes it as red and white, and that was enough to convince him maybe it's a Nephilim, then
Yeah.
we can glean from that the Nephilim too would have had some kind of pale, sickly, reddish thing going on. This white and red mix. So
Yeah.
it's you can glean a
He
lot of
also,
information. Go ahead, sorry.
and that sort of provides for some white skin color after the flood through Noah, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then with the other races through the other wives, and
Mm-hmm.
as how that sort of shows up. But also with Noah, one sort of he presumes that he was gifted additional powers,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like what the additional gifts the Nephilim would have from their godfathers. And so I'm not saying that Noah was the son of God, but it's like that. It's like there's some additional, whether it's strength, wisdom, size, I mean, we don't know. Um, but there's something that's gifted there, just as that could be the parallel type of mark that was provided for Cain, because he is truly the first surviving son of Adam,
Mm-hmm.
who's going to produce offspring going forward, that he would have special recognition and maybe special power or strength or whatever it is to ward off people who would kill him.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, give them a divine marker, then those who are not of divine in that respect, would fear the
Yeah.
repercussions of damaging such a person. It does
Yeah.
make sense, doesn't it? But this is the thing I want to make clear as well for my audience. A lot of people go down the race route with this quite hard sometimes, and I think that's the mistake.
Yeah.
When I describe white skin, I'm not talking about me or you. I'm talking about
Yeah.
vampiric,
Yeah.
deathly, white, sickly. This is something else. This is unnaturally unhuman. This is not human white.
The color that you would see on Chinese masks,
Yes,
theater masks, or some of these statues
absolutely.
in Southeast China, and that
Yeah.
sort of feature. And yeah, it is clearly something distinct from
Human
the
skin
white
color.
skin of human. Yeah,
It's
it
not
is.
that. It's another thing. It's separate from. It's a divine trait of the Nephilim specifically. It seems, which is quite bizarre. Yeah.
And what's one of the other thing that's interesting about the book of Lamech of Cain is that it's part of the Manichaean giants,
Mm-hmm.
as it allegedly and stated to come from the Vatican to be translated.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Manichaean book of giants is a kind of a conflating of the original book of Enoch, book of giants, which is different than first Enoch, second Enoch, and third Enoch. This is the fragments that you get from the Dead Sea Scrolls
Mm-hmm.
that had combined in the time or before of Mani, who was a polytheist and Gnostic at that time, who combined it with the Parsi or the Persian, within the old Persian versions of the same period. And so you have different sort of names and things that are showing up in the Manichaean version, but this is an extension off of that series of books. So not that necessarily gives it sort of a scholastic sort of veracity to it, but you start to look at some of the things that line up so well with the other accounts of giants biblically, Book of Enoch wise, in all the different cultures, and it starts to say, hey, there's at least a main sort of stream of connections there. And in there, it's also that the giants had significant homosexual tendencies
Mm-hmm.
that still is sort of part of that whole mythos even to this day, which is kind of interesting. Um, and it could be that they just didn't have enough women to mate with.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not, I do think that in the beginning, the Nephilim had great ability to multiply in great numbers. But perhaps after the original creation, they can't do so as quickly because, again, as you link into the related book, the Lost Book of King Og, they have both before and after the flood a fertility issue,
Mm-hmm.
but not from sort of like a sperm sort of perspective or an ovaries sort of perspective from the females, but a lack of females.
Mm-hmm.
So that Latesta in the Lost Book of King Og is going to have the miracle child
Yeah.
to sort of continue the reproduction after the flood of the Rephaim.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned a term earlier on called the terrible ones, and mentioned in Ezekiel 32 and Isaiah 14. And terrible ones goes back to the Hebrew word erit, and reteam to do the male plural, just as Nephil is singular for a giant, Nephilim plural is Nephilim, Seraphim, Seraph, same thing. It's common.
Yeah.
And so they would be the Eretim as terrible ones as it's translated, but we only get the singular version out of Hebrew in that passage, but it's understood as the terrible ones.
Mm-hmm.
Now you get all these descriptions of giants and stuff like that, but then you get these two oddball pieces within the Hebrew definition. That means infertility and childless.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was an infertility issue, particularly, and maybe even stronger after the flood, or maybe it wasn't really as bad before the flood.
Mm-hmm.
But after the flood, the Rephaim are going to need human females to reproduce with after the flood,
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to go extinct if they do not. And so it sort of links all of that in, and also lays down a premise for the abominations that the Canaanites are going to take in, are going to intermarry with the Rephaim to produce the patriarchless tribes of the Bible, and nations that don't go back to a patriarch in the table of nations in Genesis 10 and First Chronicles, because Rephaim are not listed in the table of nations. So Rapha is not listed for the Rephaim shown in Genesis 14 and 15, and which is the root word for giants used 25 times after the flood, as opposed to Nephilim, which was only used 3 times in the Bible, and all referencing antediluvian giants, even as it's used in Numbers 13:33. And that the Rephaim are a tribe of giants, as they're described in the War of Giants in Genesis 14, and part of the nations occupying the land that God is gifting to Abraham. And at Arba, who is the father patriarch of the Anakim, who's also not in the table of nations, tells you none of the giants are listed in there. And then you get these 9 patriarchless Canaanite nations. You have Canaan, Heth, and Sidon, which are named, but then you have the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Hivites, all of these other names that are going to be created, who are known as the Shazu, which are hybrid human giants, 7 to 9 feet tall, typically known in the execration text, also known as the Amau and the Shemau from the more Eastern traditions. And they take their eponymous names from Rephaim patriarch. That's why their names aren't listed.
I want you to get together